This is Sam Long.
I'm John Nugent.
And I am Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. Every once in a while, we like to promote and advertise things that are going on here on campus because we'd love if you're in the area to come check them out because we think they're pretty great. And so we are of that time again. And October is the time for Restoration Appreciation Week. That was not a very good
I was going to say, if we can get some echo on that in post-production, that would be fantastic.
Where we, as a school, we take time for our 2 meetings with the campus and those off campus to come and talk about our heritage of where the schools come from and why we are who we are, I guess.
Why we do what we do and who we are and all that. So.
Yeah, and we've had some great guests in the past and this year as well. Wonderful speakers. I turn over to John, who does it all, basically.
Yeah, people often ask, is there a theme for it? I wouldn't say there's a single theme besides appreciating the Restoration movement, but both speakers' first names are Frank.
Okay. Frankfurter?
Right. It's a very frank meeting. And so the first day, Tuesday, President Frank Weller will be speaking.
Nice.
And it's good to have our president kind of cast his vision for the Restoration movement and kind of put that before our college family and the wider constituency. And then on Friday, this will be our first guest speaker who is not actually from the Restoration movement, but who has very much embodies in his thought and in his practice restoration sensibilities. And so he'll be talking about and appreciating our restoration heritage, right?
And a restoration from the outside.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And that speaker is Frank Viola. And many of you probably have heard the name Frank Viola. He has published more books than 3 of us in this room combined, including our theses right? and doctoral dissertations. He's really prolific author and a widely sought out speaker. And so we're just really excited for a chance to have him address our student body and to reflect with us on our common heritage as restoration folk. So he'll be speaking on Friday afternoon. Both sessions are going to be at 11 o'clock a.m. We invite you to come to campus and share that with us. If not, they should be live streaming. If you go to the Great Lakes Facebook page, you'll probably catch it there. I'll be able to experience those 2 sessions as well. And then on Friday, during lunch, both of our guest speakers will be meeting with everyone who attends for lunch, where the speakers will be in the front of the room, and then there's Q&A time. So with both Franks, questions can be asked about the Tuesday session or the Friday session, and usually that's a really cool discussion that happens for about an hour and a half. Some people leave after an hour because they have class, but you're invited to that as well. So,
status of Frankfurters being served for that Friday lunch.
That would be fantastic.
You can look into that.
Oh, I thought you were going to. Okay. I will look into that.
Somebody's got to talk to our chef and say, this is what you can have on the menu today. So how we can distinguish between the two? It's like, I have a question for Frank. And they're both going to say, come on, help me out here.
Frank V, Frank W, also very late in the alphabet, I'm just saying.
Yeah. Well, and the W is just 2 V's.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah. It's
a lot of overlap here.
Yeah.
I don't know if you gave the dates, but if you did, I'm going to repeat them. October 28th is the Tuesday with Frank Weller, President Frank Weller, and October 31st, which I hear is Halloween, is when Frank Viola will be. Will he be in costume?
When is he not in costume?
That's something you can also look into.
John's like, leave me alone. I've got this all together. Your stupid Frankfurters and costumes.
Yeah. And Frank Viola has been on this podcast earlier this year.
Oh, that's right.
We did an episode with him. And we're going to do an episode with him Friday evening. So you'll be able to listen to us interviewing him. And the Friday evening podcast that we record will be based on and interacting with his presentation.
Mm-hmm. So I should probably go and pay attention.
Yep. Yeah.
Exactly. I was planning on it anyway.
That would help.
Well, and we've done that with other people in the past. Like when we've had guest speakers for Restoration Appreciation, we try to get them on the podcast and have a conversation. So it's part of the rhythm of what we do here.
Yeah. And then on Saturday, him and I are going to be recording a bunch of podcast episodes for his podcast. Right. And so we'll get to triangulate our audiences and expose you to some of his stuff and him to some of our stuff. And yeah, it's all good.
Excellent.
Sounds good.
Well, with that in the rearview mirror, We continue our podcast series on First Peter. We've had quite a few episodes already and have still not gotten out of the first chapter. That's okay. It's a deep dive. That's part of it.
That's what we do.
And so we're going to pick up technically in verse 17, but we want to just back up just to remind our listeners of where we left off. In 13, based on the grace of God, you're supposed to prepare for action. You're supposed to discipline yourself. You're supposed to set your hope. And then in 14, he kind of gives an illustration. He says, like obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires that you formerly had in ignorance. Instead, as he who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all your conduct. For it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. We mostly got through there last episode. And so in 17, it picks up. If you invoke as Father the one who judges impartially according to each person's work, live in fear during your time of exile. You know that you were ransomed from the futile conduct inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without defect or blemish. He was destined before the foundation of the world, but was revealed at the end of the ages for your sake. Through him you have come to trust in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your trust and hope are in God. So, this is like kind of a call to action, right? Where he begins with saying, prepare your minds for action. And then he says, like obedient children, I said it was troublemakers. Like obedient troublemakers, that's not right. Like obedient children, don't be conformed. And then he kind of gives, so if you invoke the Father, right? In other words, you come before God, the one who judges, this is how you're to live. And the answer is you live in fear. And so there's a lot of things could be discussed there. What does it mean to live in fear? And the reminder, though, of your time in exile, which I think girds this whole book, this framework of, right, we talked about at the very beginning, the dispersion and the exiles. And that's the approach that Peter and I assume his audience are taking to their life here. Right? They're not getting too comfortable because this is not their home.
Yeah, we're not jumping ahead a little bit, but I just want to play off what you're saying there, because I think exilic living is one of the big themes of First Peter, because he's already tied into that in his introduction, and it comes up here again. And so as we try to understand what it is to live the lives we're living, we have to use it, we have to think about it in terms of living in exile. And the big picture, obviously, is Israel wandering around in the wilderness, which ended up being 40 years. But that whole time, they're like, we're not home. We know where God is taking us, and we have this destination, the promised land, that we can't wait to get to. And so exilic living has that kind of implication there, that we're kind of wandering around, we're following God, but we're not where we're supposed to be. And so we have to have a very temporary view of our existence here on earth, because we know that there's something waiting for us, and we can't wait to get to it. That's what Peter said, is this idea of something stored up in heaven for you. And so we know it's there, we know it's waiting, and we just have to be obedient during our time of exile.
Yeah, and I like the way exile is framed here. It says right after, each person will be judged according to their work during the time of their exile. And then it kind of follows up, because you know that you were ransomed from the futile conduct, like your old way of life. Like exile is not what we are being rescued from or ransomed from. Like we were ransomed from a life before our exile. We were ransomed into exilic living. Like we were ransomed into a life of being set apart, holy from the nations, and that's what has caused our exile. And so here, like the framing of exile, I think, is more positive. Right? It's the state into which we were called when we accepted the ransom of Christ for our souls, for our lives. So that's an interesting framing. There are a couple of theological questions for me, or did you want to?
Yeah, I think that's a great paradox you're bringing out, because we often frame the exile as punishment, which it was. They weren't living according to Torah, and by that I mean Israel. They weren't living according to Torah, and so the exile basically forced their hand. You either actually live according to Torah while in exile, or you will cease to exist as a nation, as a people. And so it's kind of both of those things. And you're right that, like, even Jeremiah frames it as like, yes, you're not home, but God's going to bless you in this time and this place if you keep Torah, and then eventually you will come back. And so I think that's a really great point that you bring out, that it's kind of a both and. Yes, it was punishment, but amazingly, God can use terrible things for good. and allows them to start to live into their identity, which they had not been for a few hundred years. Yeah,
and I think the context and where we kind of experience the pro and con to exile is in this big picture plan from the foundation of the world. Like for Israel, they were supposed to be in the land, and they were exiled out of it as kind of punishment and then reshaping for mission, right? Like that was their punishment for not being faithful in the land and keeping Torah. For the church, maybe exile isn't that. Like
Right.
it's, there was going to be a time in God's mission in Christ from the foundation of the world where his people would be scattered throughout the nations so that they might be a blessing to all nations. That exile was a planned one, that scattering. It's, it shows up on time. Yeah. It's just that in the context of Israel, it happens in the context of their punishment for not being faithful in the land. and so for these Christians, I'm not sure, especially these predominantly, I would assume, Gentile Christians, the audiences, right? For them, they were going to be reached with the gospel as unbelievers who live throughout the world. And what they're going to be exiled from is their pagan lifestyle that they were living in the lands. Because now that faith is not geographically centered in Jerusalem, the centers are wherever the gospel has planted churches around the world. Like for them, they would always, I would say their exilic status was predestined as part of that mission.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does, because what happens when you become a follower of Jesus is everybody around you starts treating you like you're a foreigner. Once upon a time, you were doing what everybody did. You were, whether it be religiously going to the temples or culturally engaging in whatever your local culture does. The moment you become a follower of Jesus, this transforms your life. And now you're just going to look really, really different. And there's going to be social consequences for that. It can be in your family or your community or whatever. And so to follow Jesus, this is where like you're dying to that old person and rising as a new person, means you're going to be a stranger in your own town amongst your own people. And so you have to be willing to embrace that, because even the exiles were like, someday we're going to be restored to the land. Like there's still hope in that. We're not permanent exiles, but we're going to be restored. And that becomes such a powerful metaphor for them to see their own lives, just as Israel was in exile, but really hoping for the ultimate return. There's something God has promised us, and we're looking forward to that. And so we endure our period of exile because we know that the path to get where we want to go goes through this exilic living. And so for Christians, it just becomes such a powerful metaphor for understanding, the current state of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have two theological questions from this section that I hope you guys will want to
He's
keep
going to
around.
ask the biblical studies guys.
I know, right? The guys who
So here
haven't
we go.
studied theology proper.
This will not be new to you at all. The first one had to do with verse 17.
Okay.
And you talk about, themes, Christian themes of justification by grace through faith, not by works, right? Like, but here in verse 17, if you invoke as Father the one who judges impartially according to each person's work.
Mm-hmm.
Like the God, so this is the God we're talking about.
Yeah.
The one who judges each person impartially according to their work. How does that statement that each one is going to be judged according to their work fit with the wider message that it's by grace you've been saved through faith, which is a gift from God and not by works that anyone could boast? This, Paul's in his writings tries to smuggle works out of the salvation equation, but Peter here just placing, no, God is going to judge you according to your work and each person according to their work. How do you bring these two ideas together, or are they? Is this
Sam.
a Peter versus Paul situation?
Oh, for sure. No, just kidding.
Yeah, because Peter, he's like the law, Israel. Paul, law's awful, Gentile. No, I think that's a horrible way of putting that up there. I love the listener can't see it. Like Sam's staring at me like, you got to take this one, right?
You don't have to. I got something.
It's your job to defend Paul, not mine.
No.
Oh, wow.
I'm not going to defend Paul, but I do think that when they're using these term works, they're probably using the words differently. We just assume that two authors are using the terms the exact same way. I was just having a conversation with people about this earlier today, so it's fresh in my mind. But when Paul gets to this whole idea of works of law, especially we see in Romans, I suspect he's not talking about Torah as a whole. And there are a lot of scholars who make this argument, and certainly there's a lot of debate about it. But I think when Paul is talking about works of law, he's talking about a narrow category of very outward expressions of Israelite allegiance. And so things like, circumcision and Sabbath observance and, kosher food laws and stuff like that. I think for him, works of law, it refers to these overt expressions of Israelite identity that separate you from the nations. And he's saying Gentiles don't have to do these things to be the people of God. And so that would be my argument. Like I said, I'm not alone in making that argument, but I think it's an important consideration when we read books like Romans. But when Peter's talking about works here, he's not talking about the same thing. He's talking about God, assessing people based on the choices, the lifestyle that they make. And so I'm sure there's more that we can add to it. I'm not saying that I've made the comprehensive distinction here, but I do think a distinction has to be made between how Peter uses the term works versus how Paul is using it, especially when he uses that modifier, works of law. Like, what is he specifically talking about? So be careful we don't assume they're talking about the same thing here and then start pitting them against each other.
Sure. I see what you're saying. I think it's closer to the law than you give it credit for, and here's why. Because in the context, going this back, where first of all, I'd say we're talking about two different things. You're being judged according to your works. Nothing in that says your salvation is being judged by that. It's just he's going to judge you. Because earlier he says, concerning your salvation, it's prophesied, all these things, it's revealed to you. And so in order, now that you're receiving the salvation, what do? You prepare your minds for action. You are like obedient children. You are holy as God is holy, which is the same calling as the Israelites had. So God enters into this covenant with them, saved them, brought them salvation out of Egypt into the promised land, and now their response is, be holy as God is holy, and they gave them the Torah. And so they also were judged, and they were judged to be lacking, which led to the exile. And so now we have kind of the context of it all. He's coming to them and saying, okay, salvation is there. You also are being called to be holy. And so you need to start living out that life that God has provided for you. And so it's going to go on to talk about these ideas of there's this feudal conduct that exists. That's not part of it. And so for me, it's more of if you say you're part of this thing that God is doing in you and through you, your life really should display that through your holiness and through your conduct. And so for me, I don't know, you're welcome to prove me wrong, that what he's talking about, the judging, is not necessarily about salvation, but judging, are you doing the things that we're kind of all agreed to?
Well, no, I think you and I are a lot more close than maybe you were
I'm
saying.
just messing with you. I'm making people happy that say we don't disagree.
I know, we should disagree more because then we get more listeners.
You couldn't be more wrong right now, Ron.
No, I think even Paul would affirm that so much of what God is revealing to us through Torah is bringing us into alignment with his good plan for creation, and God is trying to draw people back to his thoughts, his intentions for creation, and Torah plays a big part of that. And so we see in that God moving us in the direction of coming into alignment with him. Like I said, I think with Paul's taking, people assume that Romans is Paul's gospel. I'm I just don't think that's a good way of reading Romans. I think Romans is Paul trying to explain how Gentiles can be included in the people of God without becoming Israelites. That's the pushback. People are yes, we are God's people, and if you want to be a part of the people of God, you got to become an Israelite. And these are the overt expressions of what it means to be an Israelite. And Paul's no, we've seen God pour out his Spirit upon the Gentiles, uncircumcised, working on the Sabbath, eating BLTs, whatever. We've seen God pour out his Spirit upon these Gentiles apart from them becoming Israelites with these overt expressions of what an Israelite looks like. That's got to mean something to what it means to be the people of God. And so I think Paul's pushing back. He's trying to explain this in the book of Romans, how these Gentiles can be part of that community. Peter's not trying to do that. He's talking about something more broad. And so the idea of works in Paul versus works in 1 Peter here have to be understood very, very differently.
Yeah, I think, I'm pretty sure you guys are similar.
I think we are very similar.
But but the Ephesians 2:8 is the passage I was quoting. But saved by grace through faith, right? Yeah. And so it's not just the Roman situation. Ephesians is kind of a cyclical letter sent to multiple churches. This is part of how he articulates the gospel, right? But I think he has in mind what you're talking about, the polarization between Jewish identity markers
Right.
and the
yeah.
laws that uphold them versus the calling to holy living that was for all Israelites and all Christians, that they share in common. And it's probably he's talking about the shared in common part. But a couple of observations, and I don't have the Greek in front of me, but I mean, here it's judges impartially according to each person's work. It's singular, right? It seems to be almost like you're, does that bear out in Greek?
Yep. Hold on. I'm going to take here. So that's verse 17. Make sure I'm looking at it right. Work, singular, accusative, singular.
So I wonder if it's kind of like not like your specific deeds, like pork laws, circumcision laws, Sabbath laws, but like your life's work, like you're, looking at you as a whole is going to be what your judgment is based on. And it reminds me of like Jesus's teaching, like the parable of the sheep and goats, like the whole theme of there is a judgment day. And on that day, Jesus is going to ask, I was hungry, did you feed me? Right? I was thirsty, did you give me something to drink? I was in prison, did you visit me? And these specific works, or cumulatively, your cumulative work representing Jesus, it's not that those works save you. It's just those works judge the claim that Paul makes in Ephesians 2:8, that it's your faith, right? You're going to be judged. It's by grace you've been saved through faith. So your salvation is always by grace, but your contribution to that is faith. And I wonder if the parable of the sheep and goats and did you feed me is not really, because if you fed me enough times, you've earned your salvation. It's like, no, if you've been involved in this kind of work, then you're a person of faith.
Yeah.
And if you're a person of faith, God's grace will save you.
Yeah.
So I wonder if the work that's being judged is the judgment of, are you a Jesus follower? Are you a person of faith? Can I look at your life's work, which is a cumulative of a bunch of factors, right? Do I see someone who is a disciple of Jesus, who has faith in Jesus Christ? If it is, God's grace will save you. But the judgment is the discernment based on your life, whether you were a person of faith.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of explaining it, because a lot of people want to take faith as just mental assent. I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I believe he rose from the dead. And so that belief is all that God is looking for. And even people who would affirm that still recognize that there has to be a lifestyle that goes with it. But I think what we're trying to do is really push that lifestyle element to say, if you claim faith, your lifestyle has to look like the faith you claim. And that's the whole point James is trying to make, that faith without works is dead. And I think, some people think that James and Paul are fighting with each other. And I'm like, no, I think Paul would affirm that if you say Jesus is Lord, then your life is going to reflect his lordship. And God is going to look at that and say, yes, you said he's Lord, and your lifestyle reflected that lordship. That's how faith works. And I think that Peter's affirming it. I think that James affirms it. People want to say that Paul doesn't. And I'm like, you're not reading Paul very closely if you think that Paul doesn't.
I mean, his fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah, right.
I mean, this is what, if the Spirit is in you, if you're a person of faith, right? We should see these fruit.
Exactly. Agree.
Yeah. And so if God looks at us and he sees not the fruit of the Spirit, but the works of the flesh, various forms of immorality and corruption and lying and deceit, then, God's judgment upon you is that you're not a person of faith. So the blood of Jesus is not going to cover your sins.
Yeah. And it does. It has to be more than just words. It has to be more than just something that's happening in our heads. It's got to be a lifestyle. And, to also clarify, we're not saying that it makes you perfect. None of us are claiming to be sinless people. But at the same time, people should be able to look at our lives and say, you look like somebody who really cares about God. And you look like somebody who really cares about Jesus. And so it's not about being perfect people, but about people whose lifestyle says, even when I make mistakes, I can call it a mistake because I know it doesn't live up to God's expectations. And so we care enough about God to organize our lives around those commitments.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, Sam?
No, I think you covered it.
All right.
I'm fine with that. I'll accept it.
Yeah. I mean, this is a pregnant theological little paragraph. I mean, we could spend time in verse 18 talking about ransom by the blood of Jesus. This is one of the atonement theories, right? The ransom theory of atonement that was very popular in the early church, that we've talked about in our, what did the work of Jesus accomplish for us series, which was 18 episodes long? I don't know.
Pretty long.
It was one of our big ones.
It was a really long one. Yeah.
And so, but the other question I wanted to ask is a verse that's always stood out to me is verse 20, and talking about Jesus, right? The blood of Christ. He was destined before the foundation of the world, but was revealed at the end of ages for your sake. What is exactly, what does it mean that Christ was destined before the foundation of the world?
Yeah, man. Yeah, because that's like getting into these words, and like the lexicon is going to solve the problem for us. So the word, destined, prognosko, it means to know something beforehand. It's kind of related to our word prognosis. That word comes from that same Greek word.
But it can also have connotations of choosing as well.
This is where it gets tricky.
Sorry, didn't mean to.
No, it's a good thing to bring up because this is how the debate's going to move forward. It's because, to gnosko just means to know something. Right. And then you add that prefix to it, and it's like to know something in advance. Well, is it just foreknowledge? Does it somehow imply a choice that you make beforehand? This is where the debate comes in. It's like, how are we going to define that? Because the lexicon's not going to solve this for us. And different people are making arguments for why they think their definition is the best way to explain it. And I think that the way we have to explain it is to look at the whole of Scripture and say, what do we see broadly that informs our understanding of this idea of knowing something in advance? And I know that's hyper-literalistic. I'm not saying it's the only definition. But how are we going to get to the definition of prognosko on this? Or prognosis, whichever, here it's the verb, it's participle form of the verb. But
yeah, and this is not so much in the predestined debates about humans,
Right.
whether God pre-knew who would be saved, who would fall, but it's really in Christology,
Yeah.
right? Is God sending Jesus a response to things that happened throughout the whole Old Testament story with Israel, or is God sending Jesus baked into God's original purposes before he created the world? And then in that case, did God, so how much, right, of God's, so, if you have notions of exhaustive divine foreknowledge, this all just fits nicely, right? If you have a more nuanced view of divine foreknowledge, that God seems to foreknow some things with certitude, and other things he's kind of left up to human choice, which I think when we talked about our series, I think on divine knowledge or divine change or whatever, we tend to just land more in the latter category, is his knowing that he was going to send Jesus. What is implied by all that?
Right. It's so as someone who believes that God is working with humanity as we go along in history, you have a verse like this that really throws a wrench in that, because it sounds like God's like, we're going to do all these other things, but they're not really going to matter because I got Jesus in the bullpen ready to come out when I'm ready, right? And so it's kind of like, then what was the point of it all?
Why Abraham?
Right.
Why
are we doing all this? And so we got to figure out a way to reconcile this verse with a view that says, no, God wanted Abraham and his descendants to be that blessing, and they failed. And so now God has to do something else to still bring about reconciliation, because that's God's final goal. But this verse seems to imply that that's not the case. And so that's the struggle. I don't have the clear answer, but that's the struggle.
Well, I think one way of thinking about this, and this is open for discussion because this has kind of been on my mind a lot lately, and I find it really interesting, but if you guys can poke holes in it, please do, because I don't want to follow something that doesn't really work. But I think it's really wrong to look at what God was doing through Israel as kind of a failure. But I think what it is you look back and what's the Bible trying to do? It's saying that humanity is just not listening to God. humanity's, as it says in Genesis 3, humanity's trying to be its own God and basically ignoring God. And everything's falling apart, and there's oppression and violence and abuse and all these kinds of things. Horrible stuff is happening. And we're to the point where God's like, the only way I can fix all this is, resurrection, renewal. But I got to get people to that point. And so he's got to get them from the point of not listening to being able to listen to things that go well beyond just what's happening in the material world. Like resurrection, renewal. This is like big, obviously, literally earth-changing kinds of things. So what does he got to do with Israel? Well, first he's got to get a people who will just pay attention to him on life in this world. And he gives them instructions. He's like, here's how you're supposed to live, and here's what you got to do in order to meet with me and all this kind of stuff. I got to get a people who will just pay attention and do what I'm asking them to do in the material world. And Israel took a long time getting there, but they got there eventually. It took exile to sort of get their attention. But finally, they're like, yes, not only we got to listen to God, but we got to be obedient and all that. And it's like, okay, finally, you've arrived. You've become that people I was envisioning. So now if you're willing to listen to me with regard to how you're living out life in this world, let's get to that next step, which is fixing the brokenness of this world and renewing this world. And to do that, I'm going to send my son as my spokesman. All this other stuff I was able to work well up to this point, but the next stage is going to require something bigger. And he sends Jesus. So God, he didn't fail with Israel. He just had to wait for Israel to get to the point where they're doing what he wanted them to do, which would usher in the next step of bringing Jesus and saying, okay, let's talk about resurrection renewal, which they were already kind of talking about. And so I don't think we have to look at Israel as a failure as much as Israel took a long time to get to the point where God wanted them to usher in the next stage, which was always to bring Jesus. I know that's just a different way of looking at it. But I'm open to whatever I'm missing there. Like if there's holes in that explanation, I really want to know what they are.
You want to go first or second?
I don't know. I mean, because I've been thinking of. You go ahead. I was hearing you say that I might have a metaphor of it that may or may not work that I'm interested in.
I think that's fundamentally sound. Listen and spokesperson might be a little too narrow. I might want to, but that God, I have to backtrack a little bit, and then I'll talk about where our views overlap and are similar. And I don't think they really are fundamentally different, but that this language at least presupposes that God knew the world would eventually need Jesus. Before he created the world, he knew what he was going to create was going to need him to get personally involved in sending his son at some point, right? I think this passage seems to, that's not the same as exhaustive foreknowledge, but at least God knew what kind of creatures he was creating, what they were capable of, and that they would probably fulfill that capability, which would give the need, right, for Jesus at some point to enter the story. But I suspect he also, and I think there's language to this effect, also foreknew the Abraham response, like that he was going to respond to his creatures' actions, whether success or failure, at some point by creating a set-apart people in the world that he's going to create for himself, reveal his ways of life to, that they would walk in those ways, and they would learn his ways, and then at just the right time, he would send his son to fill them with his spirit and scatter them globally. So that the world was going to need the Abraham thing, and the Abraham thing to go global would need the coming of Jesus. And so it didn't have to happen exactly the way it happened in the Old Testament, but at some point, Israel was going to reach a point where their willingness to answer God's call and already beginning to walk in that call, so more than hearing, but ordering their life in set-apart ways. And I think you probably mean that, because even in Greek and Hebrew, the word for hear and obey are kind of linked conceptually, right?
Oh, yeah, without that.
Walk in those ways, that at some point, that project was going to go global, and that the Messiah is going to be God's agent to take Israel from wherever they have gotten until that point and prepare them for that global scattering and mission. So I think, yeah, to me, this makes me theologically, if I didn't have this verse, I might be just as content to say Jesus was God's kind of new plan in response to Israel. But with this verse, I have to say that there was a sense in which God always wanted Jesus to come and finish the formation of his people and equip and send them globally to represent him throughout the world. And so that calling, so I think that's in full unity with what you're saying.
Yeah, I think those two explanations complement each other very, very well. I do. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, I was asking you.
Okay.
All right, Sam, now you can respond to both of them.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. But I struggle with it because of where I am on God's foreknowledge and all the rest. But here's a pretty clear verse that he had this idea. Because without Jesus, how does sin and death be dealt with? It's not dealt with in the Torah in that way.
Right.
And so on some level, you need Jesus for that. Like a people that follows Torah doesn't get you there. And so I think what you're saying about God knowing that had to happen in order to overcome the effects of sin and death, like, yes. And so my metaphor, which it doesn't work with that, but I'll give it anyway.
Sure.
So it's baseball playoff season, and we were talking about the playoffs right before we started. And one view is like, God has a starter, Abraham, and the goal is for that starter to go the whole game, pitch the whole game, and you win the game. That's the goal that the manager puts out there typically. But if that doesn't happen, there is an actual someone in the bullpen that can be brought in to finish it up and get you where you're trying to get to. And so that's Jesus. Obviously, you didn't catch on. I know. It's a very complicated metaphor. And so it kind of brings in, we're like, well, God knows that, like, if this fails, I always have Jesus to rely on. Like, that's his knowledge. That the foreknowledge is like that we're going to do this thing with Abraham, but if that doesn't work out, then I do have Jesus to come off the bench. But that doesn't really jive with what we're talking about here, where God knew, like, there's the reliever had to come in, or you never would have a chance to win the game if you're going to extend the metaphor. And so that's kind of what I was like rattling around my head.
Can I tweak that?
Sure, go for it.
I think the limitation of that metaphor is that in baseball, the reliever comes in and the starter checks out. He's done for the game.
Right.
But what if Jesus is not the reliever? He is the pitching coach, right? Who, like, at certain point, the starter is going to lose his way, start to get sloppy, lose confidence, or whatever. And the pitching coach is going to have to come in to stabilize him.
Okay.
Right? And say, all right, this is where you have to stop using that pitch. You don't have it anymore. I need you to finish with all fastballs. Right? And then says, now get back in there. And here's a little pine tar.
Oh my gosh! So now God's cheating.
Wait a minute! I don't think I like this metaphor
He's
anymore.
cheating death on some level,
but he finishes with the starter, which is the set apart people, because Abraham's descendants never really leave the game. But you know what I'm saying, like, he knew that the pitching coach is going to have to come in and get you stabilized because you're losing it. You still have potential to finish this game strong, but not the way you're going. But obviously, all the analogies break down. But it would need to be an analogy where I feel like the starter finishes, because Jesus doesn't replace Abraham. Abraham's descendants can now set aside. He, refines them, commissions them, fills them by his Spirit. He ascends into heaven, then fills them with the Spirit, and says, "Now go finish what we started." Yeah. And then I'm going to come at the end and take you across the line. Maybe we needed a football metaphor. I don't know.
Maybe.
Maybe baseball is just the wrong metaphor.
That's fine.
I don't know. But one of the things that I really want to get people away from is this belief that somehow Israel failed and Jesus is there to pick up the pieces and come up with a better plan. Israel didn't fail. In fact, at one point...
Well, they did break the covenant, but they didn't fail in a final way that...
Right. It's not failure, I'm done with you, I have nothing left to do with you. Because when Jesus was, when man asked Jesus, what do I have to do to get eternal life? Like, that's the question. He's like, do what Moses told you. You'll be fine. The guy's like, I did it. Jesus is like, he doesn't say, no, you didn't. He doesn't like confront him. He's like, oh, good job. You did what Moses told you. Now here's one last thing. Go sell everything and be my follower. And that's where the guy loses it. But it's interesting that Jesus makes a place for eternal life coming from obeying Moses. That means that Jesus didn't look at Moses as like, well, God had a good idea with Moses, but it didn't work out, so scrap that, let's come up with a different plan. No, there's something in Israel's history that was central to the plan and that in God's eyes works. And so the question is, how does then Jesus fit into that? Where does he come in? And that's why I like the metaphor. It's like, Paul talking about in Galatians, comparing Israel to like being a child, but when you grow up, things aren't always the same. And it's like, yeah, we grew up. It took exile. It took a lot of bad things to happen. But as a people, we grew up. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't get off track in other ways, and Jesus is now trying to get us back on track. But I think in important ways, Israel finally matured, but that maturity led to a new set of issues that had to be resolved. And those who listened to Jesus realized, oh, in our maturity, we got off track over here. Now we just got to follow him to get back on track, and not everybody really want to do that.
Yeah, I think that's the way you described it, with Moses' ways still being the way. I think there's a lot in 1 Peter to back that claim up. Like he just said, be holy for I am holy. Like this is from Torah.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Israel under Torah, following the teaching of Moses, had to be holy to accomplish their part in God's mission. Now the Messiah has come, the church, which in future chapters he's going to refer to as that priestly nation set apart, using Exodus and other Torah language to describe now the church. Like, yeah, he definitely feels like the church stands in continuity with Torah, and not just because they are the successors, the church is the successor of Israel, but precisely because the way under Torah they were supposed to be holy, now we have to be holy. And the way the set-apart way of life that God called Israel to was necessary to their mission. So we're going to find out in the next chapter, your set-apart way of life is going to be crucial to your role in that nation, in that mission. Like that, the Abrahamic strategy of God using a set-apart nation with a set-apart way of life as his means of attracting all people to himself, that was at the core of the Abraham mission, remains the core of the church's mission. And Jesus did nothing to change that formula. He's the one who called him a city on a hill, right? A light. And he's the one who endorsed that overall strategy for God's people, but he just enabled them to fulfill it in a way that they couldn't do without him. So maybe our audience needs to send in some metaphors, unless you've thought of a different one.
No, I'm still rolling around my head.
Yeah, well, and thanks to you, I'm thinking of like all sports metaphors. Maybe I need to come up with
By
something.
default, I can't help it.
Well, I mean, we're guys. Maybe a lady listener can come and go, can we do something other than sports? Maybe come up with something even better. It's like, I guess if we weren't guys, we would have thought about that. But
I mean, you should have thought of gardening metaphors, but that's fine.
I use them all the time. And so my concern is that people are like, yeah, can we come up with something different?
There's probably a sailing metaphor that'd be perfect.
Or the numerous guys out there that don't think in terms of sports metaphors.
Fair enough. Yeah. I was painting with a very broad brush.
You think so?
Guys, sports, girls, not sports.
Yeah. So
a lot of girls on campus would disagree with you.
Now all the listeners are going to come after me for that. You are right to do so.
Guilty as charged.
He repents in dust and ashes.
Yes. I will pour dust on my head as soon as I walk out of here. So, and now we're kibitzing because we got like 90 seconds left to fill up.
Was there anything else from this section?
I just think 21's great.
Yeah.
Through him, you have come to trust in God. And by him, we mean the one destined, meaning the one ransomed, right? That's the one. You've come to trust him, who raised him from the dead. And that's that part we're talking about. That raising from the dead did something that Abraham and his descendants could not do. And that it's gave him glory. And so now your hope and your trust are in God. And while living out Torah or living out a holy life may reflect your commitment to God, God's the one who's doing it. And so for me, it reinforces they didn't view Torah as a get to heaven thing. Like they weren't trying to earn their salvation. I think we're close to being past that in churches, but every once in a while it kind of sneaks in. And like this is Peter's who didn't say that. is clear that they understood Torah as we're responding to what God has done. We're not earning anything from God. And so, and this just really puts a fine point on it. And so our faith is clearly in Jesus, the one who has come and who has been resurrected and raised the dead, and there's this glory, and that's what we put our hope in, and not anything that we could do. And so it's faith works, but not really. It's yes, both and.
Or both and,
yeah. And I think where people kind of get lost is the passages that seem to downplay Torah, and I think that's probably because of a translational issue that Jesus really kicks off and makes normative, I think, is that Torah is how God set apart the Israelite people under the conditions of the Old Covenant. Jesus brought most of that forward, not all of it, but most of it, and the new language framing that he puts, that his global community, that Israel kind of having grown and expanded Jew and Gentile into the church, that they think of it as living out the kingdom, right? Living out kingdom. And the kingdom way of life is holy and set apart, and it fulfills and includes, most of Torah. If you bracket the ceremonial and stuff like that. But so there's still a judgment, and there's still a holy, set apart living that's still required according to God's plan, and it stands on the shoulders of Moses. But there's a language framing in terms of, but the kingdom is like this, and this is how you live. But I think when they use kingdom language to talk about how his people should live, they're thinking that functions for Christians much in the way that Torah functioned for Israel, and that so much of Torah is embedded in that kingdom way of life. And maybe that's where people kind of get lost, is the translation from using Torah language to kingdom language, to think that there's no set apart way of life that he's going to be judging you by.
Peter would disagree. Yeah. All right. Well, we got through 3 verses, give or take. That's okay. That's fine.
Good conversation.
We're in no hurry. Hopefully you're not either.
But these are weighty theological verses, and I thought they needed time.
Sure. Agreed.
Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class, because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Social media pictures and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris. Audio mixing and editing is done by Drew Nyquist. If you've enjoyed this episode of ACP, you might also enjoy GLCC's Master of Arts in Practical Theology degree. In this 36-hour program, you will receive first-rate biblical and theological instruction from John, Ron, Sam, and several of their colleagues at Great Lakes Christian College. To learn more about this program, visit glcc.edu. Get practical and go deep at GLCC.